It's been nearly 2 weeks and the protesters in Egypt are still calling for the president to leave. One of the main reasons they are angry, money and corruption. Many Egyptians feel the only ones benefiting from the country's wealth are businessmen with ties to the ruling National Democratic Party. How did Egypt become so corrupt, and what can a new government really do about it? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Divya Gopalan. Since the protests began against Mubarak's regime, reports about the wealth of Mubarak, his family and the people close to him have started to emerge. They paint a picture of a state where wealth fuels political power and political power buys wealth. According to some reports, Mubarak himself has an estimated net worth of $40 to $70 billion. Paul Brennan has the details.
Gamal Mubarak's exclusive London address on a street where the houses cost more than $8 million each. As one of the few known examples of the Mubarak family wealth, this property has been the focus of protesters' anger. But this impressive home is undoubtedly just a hint at the enormous wealth that the Mubarak family and their associates have accumulated over 30 years in power. As well as owning numerous prime locations in Egypt, the president is reported to have substantial properties in Manhattan, London and Beverly Hills. But his trusted political allies have also benefited. Opposition groups in Egypt accuse the ruling NDP of operating a cartel when it comes to lucrative business deals. It's alleged the most lucrative contracts are handed out to a select and exclusive group of politically connected businessmen.
You find a lot of businessmen are actually ministers in Mubarak government. Mohammed Rashid, he's a minister of trade, for example. Others also, they got prominent position in the government. So they control the governments and they control also the business sector.
For evidence of the close links between politics and business in Egypt, look no further than disgraced tycoon Hisham Talat Mustafa. His father's company, the Talat Mustafa Group, built the San Stefano Grand Plaza in Alexandria and major developments in Sharm el-Sheikh. Hisham himself became a billionaire through various construction and property deals. And until his conviction for murder in 2009, Hisham was also a leading figure in Mubarak's National Democratic Party and a member of the Shura Council, Egypt's upper legislative house. And the company's links to Mubarak's National Democratic Party remain strong. TMG's current chairman is Hisham's brother Tarek, and he also happens to be chairman of the Egyptian Parliament's Housing Committee. The development company Palm Hills is another which seems to have benefited from close political allegiance. It has seen extraordinary growth and huge profits in the last 4 years. The chief executive is Yassin Mansour, the brother of a former government minister. Another executive is related to Ahmed Al-Maghrabi, a former government tourism minister. According to the group Transparency International, Egypt ranks a lowly 98th in the world when it comes to tackling domestic public sector corruption. The boardrooms of the country's top companies certainly suggest that, in Egypt at least, it pays to be connected. Paul Brennan, Al Jazeera, London.
Just last week, Egypt's Attorney General issued a travel ban on several ministers and members of the ruling party and froze their bank accounts. The move was seen by many as a concession from the government to try and contain the anger of the people who are riled by the corruption that has plagued the ruling classes. Initial figures made available to authorities investigating their finances showed their assets reaching staggering numbers. Here's a look at what some of the more prominent members of government have managed to amass. The wealth of Ahmed Ez, the former NDP organization secretary, is estimated to be at $3 billion. Ex-Minister of Tourism Zuhair Garana is said to have racked up $2.2 billion. With slightly less than that, the wealth of former Minister of Trade and Industry Rashid Mohammed Rashid is estimated to be at $2 billion, while former Housing Minister Ahmed Al-Maghrabi is believed to have assets of more than $1.8 billion. And former Interior Minister Habib Al-Adli, the man who ran the police, is estimated to have $1.4 billion. The Cairo Appeals Court has also approved the decision of the Attorney General to reveal the secret accounts of the former officials. Joining us now are our guests in Berlin, Arwa Hassan. She's a senior program coordinator at Transparency International. In Dubai, Ibrahim Hayat, he's an economist and business analyst. And in London, Hassam Abdullah, he's a UK-based Egyptian activist and a member of the Egyptian Association for Change. Let's start with Arwa Hassan. Firstly, can you tell us how widespread is corruption in Egypt?
Well, I think it's safe to say that it is fairly endemic. And we at Transparency International conducted a series of studies, so-called national integrity system studies, that look at all the institutions that make up a country's integrity system. That means the legislature, the executive, political parties, the private sector, media, and the studies came to the conclusion that there were indeed a lot of loopholes in the Egyptian system, and it's the presence of these loopholes that make corruption possible.
Ibrahim Hayat, if you had to translate that into what's happened with Egypt's economy, which has been growing, how much has corruption affected life of people in Egypt?
Very deeply, basically, because there are increased powers that have been given to the police and to the Ministry of Interior over the institutional system, and with all constitutional rights and censorship extended also. Constitutional rights which have been banned basically under the emergency law that has been in place since 1967, except for 18 months of suspension, which ended in 1980 with the assassination of Sadat. So since then, all the human political rights, social rights, have been confiscated by the regime that is in place. And due to the absence of accountability and transparency, there was no way to stop the cronies of the president and his inner circle, due to this cultural phenomenon in Egypt, to have the president surrounded by a group of families who will be his front man. So there was no way to stop this corruption. And we have reached a point where people, even in the last survey that has been made recently, people are saying that the situation has degraded extremely heavily since the last 3 years, which means we were in a very degrading slope of corruption in Egypt, and this has reached everybody. People are feeling that they cannot afford. We have 40% of the population, 45%, who are living below the poverty line, which is around $2 a day.
I want to talk about what our two other guests have been saying about the deteriorating quality of life and the lack of transparency there is in Egypt and in the way things are run in Egypt. How much do you think that has led to the protests that we are now seeing on the streets?
Well, it's obviously in the heart of it, because as people getting poorer and poorer and seeing other people getting richer and richer, it creates a massive sense of injustice. You have to add to that, actually, that corruption is not only in the high echelon of power, but it actually filters down at every level. So if you want to, at the end of the day, a civil servant is getting very small salary. So to supplement that, the only way forward will be by having bribery here and there. So you cannot finish any paperwork, official paperwork in Egypt or otherwise, without actually bribing somebody and so on. The whole system is now currently created on bribery and on commissions. And in this picture is continuum. I mean, if you take the example you've just said, that the interior minister is having 1.8 billion, and let's say it is exaggerated and he has 800 million or whatever. How the hell a civil servant can make this money? How can, in any shape or form, somebody who is the servant of the people make this kind of money? Now, there are a lot of rumors throughout, I'm not sure about them, but for example, that throughout the police force and other things, everybody in the area pays money to the police to provide protection. That protection lines up the pockets of higher officers, and it keeps going up. And that's the only way these people can line up money throughout. This picture, true or not even, but the way the population feel about it makes them live with massive anger. And that by itself reflects itself in the streets as you can see it. Graduates are graduating and finding no jobs. Despite the fact that we have 5% growing of GDP and so on, the reality, as it was said, in real economy, a lot of unemployed graduates, a lot of unemployed doctors for that matter. The desire for massive immigration and the sense of, that there is nothing that can work. Mm-hmm. So people either go to drugs or try to immigrate and so on. And that creates massive resentment. That is why this movement, when it started, it was affecting middle class, upper middle class, and so on, because all of them are getting impoverished in this society at the moment.
Arwa Hassan, you've been looking at Egypt closely with Transparency International. And if we listen to what Hussam Abdullah has been saying about how far this corruption and bribery has filtered down, what is your assessment of how far it goes and how much the local population is affected by it?
Well, I think corruption by its nature tends to affect the very poor, and what the two other colleagues have been saying, in fact, completely reflects the findings of our study, and that there's a very serious conflict of interest problems. There's a very serious problem with the illicit enrichment. Egypt, for example, does have a law of illicit enrichment, but this needs to be amended. There's political interference in the work of anti-corruption agencies, so they're not able to carry out their function properly. Civil society is very limited, again, by Law 84, which some of your listeners may know, which very severely constricts the space for civil society organizations to operate. So on every level, in every aspect of daily life and in every aspect of society, we're seeing people suffering as a result of lack of transparency, lack of integrity, and lack of accountability mechanisms.
Hussam Abdullah, moves have been made to hold people accountable, to hold some of these ministers accountable. Their assets have been frozen, they've been prevented from leaving the country. Do you think that this is a genuine move to clean up Egypt, or is this more a matter of making some scapegoats to quiet people on the streets?
It's a window dressing, really. Corruption is much wider, and there is quite a substantial number of people in power must be a part of the whole picture. And I personally believe that one of the reasons why there is this movement to resist that President Mubarak goes is exactly because they don't want to open a very wide investigation into the corruption of the whole families and their relationships. And what is currently happening on the political level, in my opinion, is an attempt to deflate the revolutionary sense in the society. So you try to manage, as even President Obama is suggesting, to manage the change. And by managing it, you make people, have said that, you make some changes like the president cannot stand again, as if this is a concession, and his son wouldn't stand, and few other amendments in the Constitution. The substantial changes needed is actually to write a new Constitution, to create a parliamentary democracy, to specify the period in which people can stay in power, and to increase the transparency. And this is not what is happening. They are not even negotiating with the real powers in the street. The real power in the streets are the youth who have started this revolution and who have affected the massive number of the people to go out. They're talking to them in a patronizing fashion rather than a real way. And they are getting a lot of opposition parties which are meaningless in their presence. They were part of the system that the people have revolted against. So because of that, I really believe it's a window dressing. And there is a need for a continued pressure on the government and the army to effect a real change in the society.
Ibrahim Hayat, there are some attempts, as we're talking about, being made to call these ministers that have amassed fortunes to task. But we're talking to the tune of billions of dollars that these people have managed to make over the past few decades. What kind of an impact has that had on the economy, the fact that this money didn't actually filter down to the people?
I think it's too early now to talk about the economy, how, if you would like to change the economy one day, we have still to put in place a political process. And this is a matter of disagreement and violence between the two main groups One, it's controlling the street and is controlling the street. The other one is controlling the security apparatus. But I would like to go back to one point that has been you mentioned earlier, which is the impact on people's lives. I believe the corruption, it comes from the biggest priest in this temple of corruption, which is Mr. Mubarak himself. Mr. Mubarak came, he was surrounded by his inner circle. He came after an assassination. So he was surrounded by a group of his own cronies who used to work with him in the aviation and the Air Force. And also what happened is that Bob Woodward has mentioned before in his book, The Hijab, that Hussein Salim, the guy who was in charge of Sharm el-Sheikh and the export of gas to Israel, this man, he was one of the secret frontmen of President Mubarak. He was, as mentioned in the book, the Hijab, the book, he was saying he created a company called in France called the White Ales, and this company had 4 partners: Mubarak, Hussein Salim, and Munir Thabit, who is Suzanne Mubarak's brother, and Mushir Ghazala, who was the Minister of Defense at that time. When Sadat was there, Mubarak was involved in corruption. This company was buying arms for Egypt, and it had a lot of problems with the law in the United States in 1981, and Hussein Salim protected Mubarak. And after that, it continued. Now what happened is when you have the security apparatus taking control, this is what we call the old guard, which is now still in place, Omar Suleiman and all the other corrupted. And some others from the new guard, which is represented by Jamal Mubarak, who entered in force to the power after 99, and who brought with him all this new breed of greedy, shameless businessmen who wanted to grab everything and to use the privatization to deprive the poor citizens in Egypt from all the kind of services that were provided by the states before and the socialist regime earlier. So what happened now, when you take all this money, the country is not providing, is not financing all the services to different sectors. You know how many people are jobless in Egypt now? Officially, it's around 2.5, but I think formally it must be around 5. Next year we are expecting more than 7.8, this is official, million jobless people who will be unemployed in Egypt in 2012. We have in Egypt, this is a traditional country, we're talking about the family as the main cell, 13.4 million adults, which is around 40% of the adults who cannot get married, and this is a very traditional society with all the religious background. In Egypt, it has the highest rate in the whole world of divorce. We have around 600,000 kids who are taken care by institutions because no families can afford to keep them. We have millions who are living in the cemeteries. This is the services have degraded so deeply in Egypt. 45% live with less than $2 when we talk about ministers who have used the power to access to wealth. But also these people are also front men for the Suzanne Mubarak, for President Mubarak, for his son Jamal, for his son Ala, and all the other cronies. When we mention these figures, imagine if someone has 1 billion or 2 billion, how much money has he made to his own boss? Whether Anas al-Fuqi, who is the Minister of Information, nobody is talking about him, he's ruling a 42,000 empire of employees empire in the Ministry of Information. And all the other ones who are still there. Mubarak has had a habit before when he started talking about democracy. He said, I'm like a pharaoh. And what he did, all the other guys, you want to criticize the government, the prime minister, ministers, you do it. These are my employees. You don't like them, put them in jail. I will fire them, etc. Now he's doing the same thing.
Okay, what is emerging is a very clear picture of money that is concentrated, very concentrated towards the political elite, and very little of it filtering down to the general population. But what is also clear is that corruption is a well-known fact in Egypt, and it does happen, and it's quite widespread. So Arwa Hassan, I want to ask you, many Western governments have always condemned corruption. They often said that they will not deal with corrupt governments. But if you look at the U.S. government and the EU, they have very willingly worked with Egypt. Why haven't they put more pressure on Egypt to clean up?
Well, I think there are a variety of factors really, and I think that, USAID, which is the US government's development agency, has been trying to implement various programs in Egypt. I think, though, that it's actually very difficult to achieve real change because you're always going to come up against some kind of bottleneck. And I think this was what was happening. I previously gave the example of civil society. Now, civil society organizations and NGOs in Egypt could be arrested or imprisoned just for having a contact with a foreign entity. And that can mean just even receiving publications from a fellow NGO abroad. For receiving public funds, activists could be locked up. So for things that would not be considered offences. So what I think people need to realise is even those activists, even those people that perhaps belong to the intellectual elite and that were trying to achieve change, were quite constrained by the environment in which they were operating. Again, we see there was no protection for whistleblowers, for people who spoke out against corruption, who tried to speak out against corruption. Those people were either imprisoned or tortured, or they were actually discouraged from doing so in the first place because they knew there was going to be no protection mechanisms for them. So I think this is an issue. Access to information. It's very difficult in Egypt to obtain access to certain official documentation. All these are things that need to be in place if you want to see real change.
Okay, so Hussam Abdullah, how do you know that even with a new government you're going to have a system without corruption?
Oh, transparency to start with. That is why you need to change the constitution. That is why you need to change the laws about civil societies. That is why you need to change the whole concept of policing the country. The police is in the service of people to protect people. It is about full and utter transparency, and that is why really the fight for democracy is a fight for social justice. And the streets were so aware. They said change, freedom and social justice. I want just to come back as well to some of the even legal anomalies. Would you imagine that somebody who earns $1 billion a year pays 20% of tax, and a person who earns 1,000 or 2,000 a year or whatever still pay 20% of tax? It is the only country I know of which is one flat tax rate, regardless of your wealth, regardless of anything at all. That is assuming they put a true record for their wealth. You see, the whole apparatus needs a massive change. And there is a massive desire for a change in Egypt, transparency. But it is about literally demolishing the whole concept is that you improve in society because you please the guys above you, rather than seek the approval of the people below you. You need to constantly be representative democracy and the capability to monitor that by civil societies, by true free press. I mean, there is all sorts of aspects, even about free press. Sometimes some of the newspapers' editors would attack somebody till they get some money, and then they stop attacking them and so on. So you need a different system, a system based on openness, transparency, and a massive power for civil society. You also have asked about why did the West turn a blind eye? Because after all, the Egyptian government was doing their bidding. Their bidding in the area in every aspect, whether that to do with Israel, whether that to do with other Arab states. And as long as Egypt was creating that, between quotation, stability in the area, there was no reason to disturb the boat.
Indeed.
What really I hope they're starting to realize is the fact, actually, that by continuing oppressing the people, you have a total upheaval which is affecting the rest of the Arab world. And democracy is not only about transparency, what really creates a real peace. Because if people debate the concepts and the different articles, then they will be able to accept one policy or another.
This certainly is an issue which warrants far more discussions, but I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to our guests. Thank you very much for joining us. In Berlin, we have Arwa Hassan. In Dubai, Ibrahim Kayat. And in London, Hussam Abdullah. Thank you so much for joining us here on this edition of Inside Story. We, of course, welcome your comments and suggestions. Please email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Goodbye for now.